What is up, my fellow gamers? Today I would like to share with you my recent experiences and thoughts on two of the biggest MMORPGs on the market today, namely World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV. I started playing WoW at the end of Mists of Pandaria and have played it casually for basically every expansion since, playing the most in Legion and the least in Shadowlands. I started playing 14 around the time of the big Asmongold migration, having dipped my toes in its water before that, but I only started seriously committing to it in the summer before the Endwalker launch. Aside from these two, I also play a bit of RuneScape from time to time, as well as Fiesta a long time ago, but that was a pretty shit game though. I mention all of this to give you a bit of an image about my minor experience as an MMO player. I have never no-lifed an MMO, though I played a lot of 14 in a relatively small amount of time, but that was mainly following the story, so essentially playing a single-player RPG. I have never been one to attempt high-end content in either game, however, and for no particular reason. Usually, I simply don't have a lot of specific time slots to dedicate to consistently raiding with the guild, and I'm too much of a social coward to consistently attempt stuff in pugs or the party finder. All of this to say that I'll be largely comparing my experience as a casual player with both games, focusing on the basic stuff all people experience while playing them, so I'm not going to say that WoW's endgame gear system is better or how rated PvP is better in 14 or anything like that, because I simply have no idea. So, what will I be talking about? The leveling experience, alts, dungeons, the easy raids, casual endgame content, casual fun content, professions, and just general stuff like quality of life and overall enjoyment. I'll try to keep it relatively short, but if this video turns out to be like an hour long, my apologies. And I do hope you'll enjoy my casual dumbass opinions.
Wild and pure and forever free!
Let me start by acknowledging the difference in visual style between the two games. WoW is well known for its cartoony art style, and in modern expansions I am consistently blown away by how good this game can look while it's essentially running on a codebase that has been going on for more than 20 years at this point. Final Fantasy XIV, on the other hand, looks more toned down, grounded and realistic in the art style department, but environments, characters and especially spell effects can look absolutely amazing here as well. Textures and stuff do look dated when zoomed in at, but there is a big visual update coming in the future, which will hopefully polish up a lot that's here. Basically, both games have their own unique appearance, and I assume it depends mostly on personal preference which one you like better. To actually experience both of these worlds visually, we of course need to make a character first. The character creator in 14 is surprisingly limited in a lot of ways, compared to the big customization updates WoW's character creator has had over the years. Funnily enough, the WoW character creator lacks in other areas, like not having any sliders, so no boob slider, musculature or height slider, as well as less specific parts of the character being changeable, like a specific nose for example. 14 also lacks a race roster as diverse as WoW's. Say all you want about how WoW has been ruined by furries and scalies, but at least you can play as a full furry or scaly in WoW, which is a good thing because it's just more customization. While in 14 you are limited to human, human with cat ears, small human, tall human, Shrek human, human with scales, etc. I suppose this is to blame purely on the Final Fantasy IP, but it is sad to see how homogeneous all these races are in 14, especially when they're really not that customizable. Hrothgar being the exception here, but there's no female Hrothgar yet, so it doesn't count. At least you do get a free character creator redo at level 50, so that's pretty cool. Thankfully, there are enough fuckable races in both games, which is the only thing that matters. Just look at the amount of porn. Draenei and Viera do stuff to me, man. It's insane. After making your character and naming them, with 14 allowing a first and last name, as well as some RPG elements like choosing your birthday and your patron deity, which have no impact on gameplay whatsoever, you gotta choose your class. Now, 14 has a bit of a different terminology, with a class being the basic version of a job. like the Thaumaturge class evolving into the Black Mage job, while WoW just has classes. So whenever I do say class in the context of 14, just think job. I just mentioned this so you don't get too confused if you don't know the terminology of both games. 14 has a limited amount of starting classes, with most jobs being unlocked later in the game. But you can play every job on every race, and more importantly, you can play every job on a single character. This is one of the absolute greatest perks about 14, and it has absolutely spoiled me. Having the ability to do literally everything on one single character just feels so fucking good that every other MMO now automatically feels more limiting if it doesn't have that. In WoW then, after creating and naming your character, you must also pick a class, of course. Here, however, your class choice is limited by your choice of race, though this limitation has been widened since vanilla. There are no gnome paladins, for example, no human druids, and no tauren warlocks. This is largely determined by lore background and stuff, but it does mean that wanting to play a specific class locks you out of certain races and vice versa. There's also 3 hero classes, the Death Knight, the Demon Hunter, and most recently the Evoker. Evoker is even more special because only a Drakthir can play Evoker, and the only class a Drakthir can play is Evoker, so it's a race class preset. Death Knight can be played by basically every race, and Demon Hunter is limited to the Knight and Blood Elves for Alliance and Horde respectively. Alliance and Horde being the 2 main factions in WoW, by the way, limiting what parts you're actually welcome in the world, as well as who you can play with, though there has been a recent addition of cross-faction possibilities to close that rift in the player base. 14 doesn't have a rift like that, but it does have a Grand Company system, even though it's not similar at all. The Grand Company system has no real bearing on any gameplay or anything, it's just kind of this little role-playing part that has been abandoned since basically Realm Reborn, and they kinda just represent the 3 sides in a PvP match more than anything else at the moment. As a bit of an aside here, when it comes to class design, 14 feels a lot more streamlined, while WoW allows for actual customization within a class itself. We can, in some sense, look at 14 as having 21 single classes, or the Adventurer class with 21 different specializations. WoW, on the other hand, locking your character to a single class, but with most classes having 3 different specializations. 13 classes in all gives you about 38 specializations in total to choose from, and just in that department WoW has the numbers advantage, even though, again, it is limited to 1 class per character. But that's not all. 14 has no customization options whatsoever. Every paladin in the game has the exact same abilities. The only difference between 2 players on the same job is their gear, which is usually limited to a single best-in-slot set anyways. WoW, on the other hand, especially with the new old talent system, has or can have multiple builds per specialization, which is pretty insane to think about how much stuff you can actually tweak about your character if you really want to. In reality, however, this also boils down to looking up the correct build and best-in-slot gear, of course. Searching for the optimal build that's been simmed out in an Icy Veins hyperbolic chamber, just like 14 has its optimal rotations, mathematically determined by 3 different Singularity class AIs. As a casual player, that's not exactly a bad thing, I suppose. Sure, it's a lot of fun tinkering at it yourself while leveling, but if you want to start doing some Mythic Plus dungeons eventually, you better have that Icy Veins or Wowhead cookie cutter build, or you'll be kicked out of the group for not doing enough damage, or for using an ability you shouldn't even have in the first place because it's from a wrong suboptimal build. The only real freedom you have in 14 is picking what job to play, and within that job what order to use your abilities in, with an optimal rotation being present here most of the time as well, like I said, though usually it is pretty clear from purely the class mechanics what you're supposed to do and in what order, though some interactions may not be super obvious at first. For me personally, when playing Samurai, I didn't realize you'd make your sushi stacks carry over even after doing your Iaijutsu, which can save you an entire GCD in time to still do the same damage if you play it right. In my opinion, this system in 14 feels better, or I guess you could say feels easier. When you play a warrior, you're a tank. Simple as. In WoW, if you play a warrior, you can play tank or DPS. So it's a choice on top of a choice, which is good for some, but for me has always made it hard to actually commit. Because what if I want to play DPS while questing and roll tank for a dungeon, or vice versa? Then I have to be on top of 2 different gear sets, 2 different rotations, 2 different builds, etc. At least 14 has its own separate gear inventory to store all your different sets away, so it's a little bit better on that front at least. The main problem with this system in 14 is of course that the jobs might feel a tad too formulaic. And if you keep to playing a single job for an entire expansion, I would assume it gets pretty boring pretty fast. So on that front, WoW at least offers you the illusion of choice, especially during your leveling. While the talent points make leveling quite engaging in WoW, one thing 14 has over WoW, in terms of that feeling of progression while leveling, are the job quests. At least up until level 70 and the end of Stormblood. Leveling any job takes you through its own entire questline with its own characters, its own stakes, its own setups and its own conclusions. Usually each expansion specific storyline ending in a cool solo instance on top of it. But writing out entire questlines for every single job in the game takes time of course, with 2 jobs being added per expansion making that even harder, or rather more time consuming, so it seems they have forgone job specific questlines in favor of role specific questlines from Shadowbringers onwards, which themselves tie in more into the MSQ, so it's a bit of a give and take. But how exactly do all of these classes actually feel to play? While this, just like almost every aspect I mentioned in this video, is up to personal preference of course, it is hard to deny how responsive the combat in WoW feels. After switching back to WoW after playing 14, it was a genuine surprise how different both games feel in terms of responsiveness, with 14 being more designed with relatively high ping in mind and allowing tricks like slide casting as a result. 14 does win when it comes to impact, I feel. Not even an execute spam as Arms Warrior feels as good as popping an Ogi Namikiri, in my opinion. GCDs are also different, with the GCD in 14 being longer but providing more focus on weaving, which is the act of using off-GCD abilities during the GCD, so instead of pressing 1 button every 2.5 seconds, you can press up to 3 in that same window. WoW's GCD, on the other hand, is a lot shorter, but with essentially no weaving at all. Originally, I was tempted to say WoW felt slower than 14 after starting to play the game again, but now I realize it mostly depends on what class you play. Casters feel slow in both games compared to melee classes, with a spec like Fury in WoW also feeling faster than Arms, and a job like Bard feeling faster than Paladin in 14 for example, with the former having more weaving to it. While both games feel different to play, both feel good enough to be enjoyable, for me at least, with WoW feeling a bit smoother overall, but 14 having one big advantage in my mind. Jobs in 14 being as streamlined as they are, allow for a more unique approach to their playstyle and identity. WoW has this as well of course, warlocks and priests feel different for sure, even if they are both casters, but in my mind the difference between how jobs in 14 feel is more defined, with a black mage feeling very different from a red mage for example, with them also being both casters. This is all based on personal experience of course, I apologize for reiterating this so much, and I haven't had the time or willpower to level out every single class in either game. But when I think about wanting to play a different class in both games, in 14's case this fills me with anticipation for something new, and in WoW's case often fills me with dread more often than not, otherwise just more apathy. Onto the actual leveling experience then, which in the case of WoW has a much more diverse opening to it. It is based on your character's race instead of its class in 14, with most non-allied races having a wholly unique starting area with its own aesthetics and race-related questlines. 14 puts you in one of 3 city-states at the start of its leveling experience, determined by your starting class, as every class has its own guild, and the Thaumaturge's guild is in Ul'dah and the Marauder's guild is in Lim-Salominsa. The story here focuses more on the goings-on of the city-state you find yourself in, and all 3 starting questlines merge together around level 15 once you start heading out of your initial starting area. Then, WoW also has Exile's Reach, which is a relatively recent addition to the game, functioning as its own tutorial island, providing a more modern and curated starting experience, as well as being more of a lore-agnostic adventure. Lore and story in WoW is handled a lot differently than it is in 14, and depending on the kind of player you are, you'll either like or hate them for different reasons. 14 forces you to go through the entire storyline in order, from the start of A Realm Reborn from 2013, all the way up to the current expansion, which is Endwalker at the point this video will come out. You can skip through this, of course, either by paying for a boost, which isn't always a good idea,
Where were the hills? Where were the hills?
or simply ignoring the story altogether. Most cutscenes are skippable, and you can quickly click through dialogue boxes, but even then it can be a slog to get through if you don't want to engage with it, and it is undeniably a slower leveling experience than WoW's. WoW's current leveling experience is relatively straightforward if you actually know what you're supposed to do. You level to level 10 in your starting area, and then pick an older expansion to go through, which levels you all the way to 60. That is, if you know you have to go to Chromie to actually enable this feature in the first place, and then find your way to the correct boat or airship to board to get to your destination. At level 60, you can then go through Dragonflight itself, which is WoW's most recent expansion as of the making of this video. Since wanting an alt in WoW means doing this leveling experience over and over again, getting to max level can be insanely fast. With record times of less than 3 hours, just zooming through whatever content gives you the most experience per hour. Going through the current expansion with an alt used to be a grueling slog of doing the exact same story quests over again each time, but with adventure mode being a thing now, you can sideline the campaign quests for missed side quests, world quests, or other stuff that gives you experience without being tied to the MSQ for every single alt you're trying to level. The new player experience is also a lot different in both games. While Exile's Reach gives you a curated starting experience, complete with a little NPC dungeon at the end, and 14 requiring you to go through the Hall of the Novice to learn the basics of dungeons and whatever role you're trying to play, there's nothing in either game that will prepare you for the worst: other players. The WoW community is notorious for having a lot of spiteful people in it, who will kick anyone in a dungeon group after a single wipe because you're still learning the game, your role, and your class. 14 also has a bunch of assholes in its community, but community as a whole is a lot more self-policing, which is a bit of a double-edged sword. What 14 does differently is give new players a little icon next to their name and allows them access to something called the Novice Network, which is usually filled with more experienced players and mentors, giving useful advice to those who ask, but this has had some issues in the past as well. This simple sprout symbol, which clearly communicates to every player that you're still new to the game, does wonders for being treated with some actual respect. Even after doing the Hall of the Novice to learn those basics of doing dungeons, if you do forget to put on your tank stance or do something else wrong or whatever, people will usually point this out to you instead of calling you a brain-dead retard who should uninstall the game and go back to playing League of Legends. For the most part. The main feeling I get, and I do believe this is the general consensus as well, is that the 14 community and game as a whole can feel a lot more welcoming to new players. The simple implementation of the sprout icon does so much in curbing players' expectations, and I don't think I've ever had a personal bad experience in 14 with only a minor few in WoW over admittedly a longer period. Personally, I enjoy the leveling experience in both games, though I do enjoy 14's a bit more. I remember leveling my original character through WoW with some friends and exploring the world, and that was a lot of fun. But in the case of 14, like other people have said before, the game is more of an RPG MMO than an MMORPG. The RPG part comes first. The main focus of 14 is the story, and I do enjoy having that structure to go through. One trade-off here is that leveling alt jobs in 14, while tied to a single character, which is a very good thing, can drag on for a lot longer than it does in WoW, because there simply is no main questline to follow for each and every alt you make. The only feasible method is running your daily roulettes, or farming out dungeons, which can take a long time and become less fun over time if you're seriously grinding out an alt job in my experience. This roulette system is very nice though, being segmented into different categories, giving you a daily reward each time you run them. This is good for you to either level those alt jobs or gaining endgame resources, and is good for newer players because their queues won't be 2 hours long for their first dungeon, with the Wanderer's Tale system complementing this as well. The roulette system is also different from time walking in WoW, even though both systems are relatively similar, in the sense that your level gets synced, including your abilities, as opposed to your abilities not changing at all when time walking in WoW. Roll a level 60 dungeon in your roulette and you won't be able to use any abilities from 61 all the way up to max level, depending on what level the alt job actually is, of course. And this can feel pretty shit sometimes, especially for jobs who rely on specific abilities to make them better or to even make them playable in the first place. Black Mage. WoW has no reason whatsoever to queue for those low-level dungeons because there simply is nothing to gain from those, unless it's a time-walking event and you queue up for those. But it's not like you need to clear any dungeons to progress through the story in WoW, while in 14 it is required, as a lot of dungeons and trials are peak story content. Recently, there has been more of a focus on redoing these older dungeons in 14 and bringing them up to a more modern standard, making them more engaging in the process, as well as allowing players to run them with a party of NPCs instead of needing actual players, which has its own ups and downs. The way 14 approaches instanced content as interesting story beats and capstones to story arcs is very cool to see, with some truly epic instances being absolutely amazing to go through. Especially the trials, which are essentially just singular boss fights. I have gone back and queued up for older trials just to re-experience the fight for fun, because they were so cool and enjoyable, which should speak for itself. WoW raids also function as a capstone on big story arcs, don't get me wrong, but them being optional kind of makes them feel detached from the actual leveling story experience in a way, but killing Razageth in the Vault of the Incarnates was still pretty fucking cool. A final aspect to mention on the topic of the leveling experience is the world itself, of course, both varying wildly in terms of just what's in them, but also in terms of openness on the gameplay side. WoW revolutionized the openness a game of its caliber could be all the way back in 2004 by having every continent be its own level or instance in a way. You can go from Quel'Danas in the north of the Eastern Kingdoms all the way to the Cape in Stranglethorn in a single ride, either with your own mount or by taking the Flightmaster. Flightmasters as a whole are cool because they can really impose a sense of scale and beauty when flying over majestic landscapes. I remember the first time taking a Windrider in Legion and flying over Suramar and thinking, this zone just looks fucking amazing, I want to go here. And these senses get magnified in Dragonflight with the dragon riding mechanic, making flying around yourself actually fun and engaging for once. 14, on the other hand, has every single zone locked behind a loading screen. And with these zones often feeling smaller than similar zones in WoW, it can make the game feel less expansive. A trade-off here being that there is a lot more people allowed in a single instance or shard or whatever, without the game grinding to an absolute halt. Which is very cool to see when a new patch drops and there's so many people around you that you can hear added ambient sounds to represent this mass of people. While 14 does have a Flightmaster equivalent in the Chocobo riding taxis, basically everyone uses the Aetheryte system to move about the world. This is basically a paid teleport to every location that has an Aetheryte, which you have attuned yourself to, so you have to visit there at least once to get back there. And this system is absolutely amazing. It saves you a lot of time compared to even the fastest WoW routes by taking portals and Flightmasters, and is even lore accurate as well. One more thing I want to mention before we get into the real content is professions. Just like combat jobs, gathering and crafting jobs in 14 can all be done on the same character. This also means you have to actually switch over to that profession job to gather or craft something. Compared to WoW, where if you're an herbalist, you'll spot gathering nodes just while going around. On the one hand, the way WoW does this is nice, because it doesn't really interrupt any ongoing gameplay. Like, if you're just running or flying around on your mount, you see an herb, you pick it, and you just continue on doing what you are doing. Especially if you have the Sky Golem mount, are a druid, or in Dragonflight specifically, have the dragon riding perk that recharges your vigor after gathering something, which makes it all a very smooth experience overall. In 14, having to actively switch to your gathering job does break up that flow, but has a flow of its own to compensate. If your level is high enough, aggressive enemies will simply ignore you, so you can just chill out and gather as much as you want without getting interrupted. The gathering itself is also more involved in 14, with its own abilities and resource to spend, as well as gathering collectibles which have their own system on top of that. Fishing also has its own system of bait and weather having an impact on what fish you can catch, plus the spear fishing minigame as well. Crafting follows this same paradigm, having entire crafting rotations in 14, with the goal of crafting something of a high quality. I absolutely love this, and I've had a lot of fun leveling all of the crafters and gatherers in 14, with each one also having their own storyline, by the way, up until Stormblood, with Shadowbringers onwards being more general questlines for specific groups of crafters and gatherers, just like for combat jobs. In any case, it's clear a lot of love is present in this part of the game, it being completely optional. Even in Endgame, these professions stay relevant, with elusive gathering materials hidden behind stat requirements, and Endgame crafted gear at high quality being something you can really work towards, especially when there are new recipes being added every few patches. WoW has the limit of 2 real professions per character, with secondary professions like fishing and cooking being available to all. While WoW's professions are more limited than 14's, they are also a lot simpler to keep track of. An endgame potion will usually just need herbalism ingredients, so you can just go herbalist alchemist as a combo, gather your own materials, and buy anything of the auction house that might come from another source or you haven't gathered yourself. In 14's case, while you can also buy stuff off the auction house or market board, this is often a lot more complicated because there's entire production trees for endgame potions, giving me flashbacks to Factorio. In Dragonflight, professions did get some big updates, and it's definitely something nice to do in your spare time in either game or as a way to make some money. Now, onto the endgame content. Like with everything we have seen so far, both games have their own unique approach to endgame PvE content. In short, I have the impression that WoW has more of a focus on quantity of content, while 14 has more of a focus on quality of content. Or I guess you could say less of a focus on quantity. I won't really be talking about PvP content, by the way. I've had a little bit of fun in both games. You know, the weekly PvP brawls that WoW has are fun sometimes, and Crystal Conflict in Final Fantasy is something fun to do because it's like 5 minutes per match or whatever. But I'm not really a PvP guy, so I won't be talking about it any more than that. Now, what do I mean by saying that Final Fantasy focuses more on quality and WoW focusing more on quantity? 14 has, so far, had one raid series, one alliance raid series, and a bunch of trials per expansion. A raid series consists of 3 parts of 4 fights each, so 12 in total, with those 3 parts being spread out across the expansion, with one part being added every other patch, I believe, alternating with an alliance raid part. But each part here is one instance of 4 fights, instead of each fight being its own separate instance, with the normal raids being the real endgame content and the alliance raids being more casual, not having a harder version, but still offers up enough good gear to do them on a weekly basis, but more as a catch-up gear system for alts, or if you're not chasing best in slot gear in savage raids. Then there's also a bunch of trials, which are singular boss fights and are also spread out over the expansion, so in total you have a nice steady drip of content over the lifetime over an entire expansion, with all of the trials, raids and alliance raids also having their own storylines. In WoW's case, pretty much every major content patch brings an entire new raid with it, consisting of about 8 to 10 bosses on average, but this is not nearly as consistent as it is in 14. Shadowlands only had 3 raid tiers in total, while BFA before it had 5 if you count Crucible of Storms, which was a 2-boss mini-raid. Even then, it's still 4 raids instead of 3, which is a big difference. So, in a sense, WoW has as much individual boss fights in a single raid tier as 14 has in its 8-man raids over an entire expansion. WoW also has mythic dungeons as an alternative to raiding and still allowing you to get gear through this, which isn't something 14 has anything similar to at the moment, with max level dungeons being added over the course of the expansion, mainly functioning as a gear catch-up system instead of a gear pinnacle system. And while 14 has been adding more difficult 4-man content in the form of Criterion and variant dungeons, these don't provide you with any gear as far as I could tell. One insane difference between the raiding in both games is the amount of time it takes between doing something that actually matters. Since every boss fight has its own instance in 14, there is no downtime, except for talking over what went wrong the last pull and talking about what you're going to do this pull. Then you just attack the boss and it is go time. The entire instance is just the arena of the fight. Even within a pull itself, 14 allows for theoretically infinite battle reses, as long as there's a reserves around and their mana pool can keep up. This makes wiping on a fight still a possibility, of course, but after messing up and dying, you're at least guaranteed or almost guaranteed a second chance, instead of just maining the floor for an entire fight. In WoW, and I felt the annoyance of this already during a single raid finder wing, there is a lot of travel between bosses, filled with tons of trash to make it more interesting, I guess, but this is just boring. Dying here doesn't put you in front of whichever boss you wiped to, it puts you at the start of the entire massive raid dungeon, so you have to walk to the boss for 2 minutes every single wipe. At least that was my short experience this raid finder tier, but the final boss of the current raid was a bit quicker to get back to at least, so I mean, it's a bit of a hit or miss, I suppose. This is what people mean when they say 14 respects your time more than WoW does, because even the minor trash 14 has in alliance raids and dungeons is quickly dispatched and often feel more like mini-bosses in alliance raids anyways, with normal raids having no trash whatsoever. All of this endgame content is framed inside of the overall story that takes place here, of course. And boy, let me tell you, the writing in WoW doesn't even hold a candle to the writing in 14. There are so many inconsistencies in logic, tone, world mechanics, it's insane. Literally. At the start of Dragonflight, someone mentions it's been a few years since the end of Shadowlands, the previous expansion. Okay. And what happened? Nothing. There was this whole thing about Shadowlands and how time flows differently or whatever, but this led to nothing. Half the time a patch gets fucking dropped, even though Blizzard says, no, we always intended the story to be this way, but characters just get abandoned completely. Just look at Bane being a meme for an entire expansion because all he does is just sit on the floor. Half the time shit doesn't make sense at all because you have to read books or watch YouTube videos to get caught up on half a paragraph of lore hidden behind 3 secrets that reveal something that might be super important in the future unless Blizzard just forgets about it again. Just watch the Pyromancer Gamer Moment video to get an idea about how frustrating it is for someone who actually made content surrounding the lore of World of Warcraft. Even if we focus on just the story of Dragonflight, while overall it being decent enough, it gets marred by weird humor moments and awkward tone shifts and lacks any real impact or conclusion at the end. 14 just does everything better on this front. Characters are consistent and storylines get resolved. Side stories are interesting and even get weaved into main story sequences from time to time. The story content at launch of the expansion is the entire story concluded. You end the main scenario quest by defeating the final boss, while WoW stretches this out across the entire expansion instead of front-loading it and building upon what was established. Which admittedly is just a different way of doing it, but I enjoy the way it's done in Final Fantasy a lot more. As a comparison, If Dragonflight was an expansion in Final Fantasy, Razageth would be a boss you would fight at level 63 instead of an endgame raid boss. In 14, most things just make sense from a lore perspective, or at least get lampshaded. The writing in 14 tries to make sense of the world and its mechanics most of the time. 14 isn't perfect, but it is a lot better. New and interesting societies you encounter usually get explained and unraveled. There's entire quests dedicated to setting up how stuff works, even with an entire dungeon taking place on your way to another city. The world makes sense. In WoW, this is less so. The Dragon Isles are like, okay, it's been at least 10,000 years since anyone has been here, and everything is just here and stuff. It's a little bit overgrown, sure. I mean, this is cool, I guess, you know, there's this big city with a lot of draconids in it, but did they never venture out? Did they just meander here for 10,000 years? Like, what happened? Or were they released from their stasis, like in the Drakthir opening, and are just recently released? If so, how come the entire city isn't in complete disrepair? You know, it's just a lot of questions get generated by how WoW presents itself. And don't get me started on the Bronze Dragonflight and their timeline shenanigans, or the lore that is Warlords of Draenor, which is now just a black hole. 14 also dabbles with time travel shit, but it feels a bit more grounded in a sense, even if it is still somewhat ridiculous, and I'm generally not a fan of time travel in otherwise normal stories. 14's story as a whole is a journey, with the actual game content serving the story. There are multiple trial fights I have went back to just because they were so fucking cool and emotional to go through, like I mentioned. I don't get that feeling in World of Warcraft. Sure, the content itself is still great, the actual fights in raids are cool and fun and interesting and challenging whenever you're actually doing the fights themselves, but I've never felt as hyped killing a raid boss in WoW as I did killing the final trial boss of any 14 expansion, or even just leveling trial bosses, to be honest. I've never had tears well up in a cutscene in WoW during an emotional apex, and I've never felt any emotion at all towards characters you don't even know in World of Warcraft, or characters you've met 3 expansions before and haven't seen since. A huge factor here being, of course, the music and the insane amount of talent that 14's music is written with. Masayoshi Soken, the composer for 14, consistently knocks it out of the park with some absolute bangers, as well as elevating the emotional story beats with an amazing soundtrack. WoW's music certainly isn't bad, by the way, but it is or feels a lot less memorable than the music in 14 in general. This is perhaps by design, and some songs definitely leave an impact, like the Grizzly Hills theme or the Lights Hope Chapel theme or Invincible, but this too is an aspect where 14 just does it better in my opinion. I could go on and on about this, but the music and especially the story are aspects of both games I am 100% certain about. 14 just wipes the floor with WoW, even if WoW has its own epic moments, like Drat Gate or killing Argus and watching the cutscene, or just vibing in Grizzly Hills and fixing local issues. Both games have their moments, don't get me wrong, but the MSQ in 14 is just a few levels above the main storyline WoW has been trying to figure out since basically Cataclysm. On to more fun stuff now. Did you know that 14 has excellent boob physics? In any case, aside from the story and instanced content, what else is there to do? Open world stuff, of course. World of Warcraft definitely wins here. World quests give you an actual reason to dig around in every zone, with a new zone or 2 being added during the lifetime of the expansion, which is something Final Fantasy XIV really lacks. 14 does add a lot of new content per patch as well, of course, and it even has a system similar to World Quests in the Fates, but it seems to be largely focused on instanced content as a whole, like adding new raids, trials, dungeons and story quests. Bosja and Eureka come to mind as new zones being added, akin to Argus being added or Mechagon being added, Najatar being added, but I don't think they're as crucial or as advertised as a new zone being added in World of Warcraft. 14 does play into this part of the game, but just a lot less. Daily quests are found in both games, and those feel more impactful in 14 because of the tangible progress you make with the different tribes you're doing those quests for, with their reputation actively tied to the story progression in their little storyline of why you're actually helping them doing whatever it is you do. In the case of evergreen side content, the Manderville Gold Saucer is kind of just a better version of the Darkmoon Fair. The Gold Saucer is not limited in time, not limited in tickets or whatever, it's just a lot of fun. People call it a casino, but instead of the house, it's the player who always wins, and the things you win is having fun. There's a little event every 20 minutes. There's a weekly jackpot, a daily mini jackpot. You can play triple triad, you can play mahjong and a bunch of other stuff you can do here. The Gold Saucer is just a fun reprieve separated from the rest of the world, just like the Darkmoon Fair, but a lot more accessible. I don't even have any footage of the Darkmoon Fair because I simply wasn't playing when it was around. Now, this kinda goes for Final Fantasy XIV in general, I suppose. It feels like the game is made to be more fun, especially for a casual player like me. Sure, I've seen high-end raiders complain about how the gearing system is fucked, or about the shitty balance of the most recent fights, or how some jobs are absolutely abysmal compared to others, so 14 absolutely isn't perfect, but it is a lot of fun. Instance content, again, is where 14 really shines. Aside from those dungeons and raids that WoW also has, there's treasure maps, which can lead to a special type of treasure dungeon. You have your own island sanctuary. There's deep dungeons like Palace of the Dead, the Gold Saucer like I mentioned, and recently those Criterion dungeons as well, with ultimates also being an ultimate high-end goal to work towards, but not obtainable for someone like me who doesn't even do extreme trials or savage raids. A lot of this content that a lot of people do, or can do, is evergreen as well in 14, thanks to that roulette system I've mentioned, and the ease with which you can run old content at its intended level and item level. I've already said about the roulette system that it keeps old content evergreen by giving you rewards for it, but what does WoW grant you for completing old content? Aside from time walking, there is no real way to run old content synced like there is in 14, even if you would want to in WoW, but you can still run old content unsynced. These have historically been great gold farms until they get nerfed eventually, but the reason why most people run ICC every week is for completionism, mounts, pets, and maybe most importantly, transmogs. Both games have a transmog system called Glamour in 14, which allows you to change the appearance of your currently equipped gear so you can have your best in slot equipped without looking like an absolute clown. Compared to WoW, the transmog system and just the entire collection and completionism system in Final Fantasy XIV is an utter joke. Since the big transmog update WoW had in I think Warlords of Draenor, where every piece of gear you have ever obtained is simply marked as collected in the database, it's been a pretty poggers system, with even grey and white gear being automatically added now too. 14 on the other hand has a limited glamour inventory, even if it has been expanded recently, and even requires specific consumables to put gear into your storage and apply appearances to yourself for some reason. Compared to WoW, it feels very antiquated, and I hope they'll one day have a similar ease of use where having access to a glamour piece is just as easy as it is having access to a transmog piece in WoW. But then again, actually running old content is infinitely easier in 14 because you can just do it through the party finder instead of spending 10 minutes hopping portals and boats and a wind rider to get there in WoW. 14 did change up the achievements menu a while back, by the way, so I think it is clear they're at least continuing to improve this current system, but WoW just does this part miles better. And I could go on and on and on about both games, like saying how healers in 14 are boring to play because they only have 3 damage buttons, or how WoW is now woke, or mention something about the ancient add-on debate with both games having a polar opposite stance on add-ons, or how both games require you looking stuff up to even understand basic shit like endgame gearing, but I think I've been going on for long enough at this point. I feel it's pretty safe to say that both World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV have their own positives and negatives. There's a reason both of these games are played by so many people, and I for one am glad that 14 got that time in the spotlight to make people more aware of it, including myself. And for all the shit that's been going on at Blizzard, it looks like WoW is making some sort of comeback after the absolute dismal performance of Battle for Azeroth and Shadowlands, with the devs actually being communicative and reactive for once. For me personally, I've had a lot of fun with both games, and I'll more than likely continue playing both of them, especially whenever new content patches drop. But at this moment, my preference in general goes towards Final Fantasy XIV, which I probably made more than obvious in this video. So anyways, that was it for me. Don't expect any follow-up video to this unless I suddenly start savage raiding so I can become an MMO Andy or whatever. Because like, what other MMOs could I even look at, right? What was that? New World? Black Desert Online? Old School RuneScape? RuneScape 3? Ashes of Creation? Man, how many damn MMOs are there, bro? What the f***?